In the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion, there are a plethora of active effects as well as diseases that the player can contract. Most active effects come in the form of magical effects, consumables, enchantments, blessings, or are based off of race, class, and star sign, and are mostly temporary with a few exceptions being permanent. Some common examples include water breathing, which allows the player to breathe underwater, feather, which lowers the player's current encumbrance, damage health, which lowers the target's health over a period of time, and invisibility, which renders the player invisible to other NPCs and enemies. Active effects can be used by both the player and against the player and can have some game-altering results in combat, stealth, navigation, and speechcraft scenarios. They also come in variations of restore, fortify, and absorb, and can lead to either resistances or weaknesses from the player or NPCs. Diseases, on the other hand, really only affect the player, and in pretty much all instances, depending on how you look at it, have negative effects. Diseases are contracted by being attacked by monsters and animals throughout the wilds of Cyrodiil. A fun fact is that some beggars in the cities actually have diseases as well and can pass them on to the player when provoked. Most of the time, beggars flee from combat, so it's a rare occurrence but can still happen. Some common diseases the player can contract are rock joint, which comes from zombies and drains agility for 10 points. Brain rot comes from rats and drains strength for 10 points. Chills comes from headless zombies and drains intelligence, agility, and willpower, all for 10 points. And Witbane comes from dogs and drains intelligence for 5 points. The chances of actually contracting diseases from enemies during combat are low and certainly don't happen with every fight, but are still common occurrences throughout the game. Diseases don't go away on their own and can only be cured by a potion, spell, altar, or way shrine. Remember before when I mentioned that depending on how you look at it, all instances of receiving diseases are negative? Well, there's one disease that, while yes, it still has negative effects, leads to arguably the most game-altering condition in the Elder Scrolls series. The disease in question that we'll be discussing, and then moving on to the grander scale of, is called porphyric hemophilia, which not only drains fatigue for 5 points, but after 3 in-game days, transforms the player into a vampire. And the main discussion point of this video is if vampirism is actually worth going through in the Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion. To begin, here's a little background on vampires in Oblivion. Vampires are said to be an indirect creation of the Daedric prince Molag Bal, according to a tome found in the official plugin of the Vile Lair. The legend states that Molag Bal was the father of the first vampire, which in turn makes all vampire kind a creation of the Daedric Lord. In the book Immortal Blood, it describes there being over 100 different kinds of vampires in Tamriel. In the wilds of Cyrodiil, the player can encounter 22 different classes of vampires. Only certain races can be certain types of vampires. For example, vampire assassins can only be dark elves, vampire crusaders can only be orcs, and vampire monks can only be Imperials. The most powerful vampires that are not notable characters in the game are called Vampire Matriarchs and Vampire Patriarchs, and these can only be found in select dungeons and caves. Each vampire enemy you come across in the game is considered to have Stage 4 Vampirism, which is the maximum level. We'll go over these stages and levels in just a bit. There are about 7 named and notable vampires in the series which go beyond a randomly spawned NPC. The most notable ones are Janus Hassildor, the Count of Skingrad, Vicenti Valtieri, a member of the Dark Brotherhood, and Jackben, Earl of Imbel, who is actually the famous Spring-Heeled Jack. There are 8 quests in total that directly deal with vampires and vampirism, one of them being in the main quest line where Azura asks you to kill some Forsaken worshippers turned vampires. The final piece of background information, and perhaps the most interesting, is that according to unused game files, vampires were supposed to be a whole separate race that could be picked at the beginning of the game. How and why is unsure, and that is likely the reasoning for it being scrapped. Now, how does one contract porphyric hemophilia, the disease that leads to vampirism? There are 3 ways to receive this disease. The most common way is by fighting vampires in caves and dungeons, and after taking enough hits and damage, the game will tell you you've officially contracted the disease. The second way is in the Dark Brotherhood quest titled Darkness Eternal. Vicenti Valtieri, a vampire himself, will offer to give you something called the Dark Gift. If accepted, upon sleeping, he will visit you and you will awaken with the game telling you you've contracted the disease. The third and final way is a little more obscure but can be contracted while doing the quest Unearthing Mehrunes Razor, one of the official plugins for download. One of the options the player can do towards the end of the quest is steal Sirey Feithung's heart and eat it. This will, among other things, give the player the disease as well. Interesting to note is that even with an extremely high aptness for resisting diseases, porphyric hemophilia can still be contracted. After contracting porphyric hemophilia, the player has 3 days to look for a cure before fully transforming into a vampire. The best and easiest cures are to drink potions of cure disease or to pray at way shrines and altars. 3 in-game days is considered to be a long time, and the player can easily complete their current quests or adventures with the disease before even needing to go and cure it. Once cured, your fatigue will be restored and there is no longer a risk to becoming a vampire unless infected again. But let's say the player wishes to go through with the transformation and forego looking for a cure. After 72 in-game hours occur and the player goes to sleep, a message will pop up saying, "You dream of someone sleeping peacefully in his bed, when a shadowy, gaunt figure silently enters the room. Approaching the bed, the figure leans down and sinks its fangs into the sleeping person. After a few moments, the pale figure rises, blood dripping down his or her chin. As color flows back into the vampire's face and his or her features fill out, you recognize the face as your own. You awake screaming." Interesting to note is after 3 in-game days, even if you try to cure the disease, you will still become a vampire. The only thing you can do at this point to put off becoming one is by not sleeping, which is cause for a whole slew of other problems. Upon waking up and receiving that disturbing message, some immediate effects take place. Your character is now 100% resistant to both paralysis and diseases, which is pretty helpful. These are the only 2 effects that stick around regardless of your level of vampirism. There are 4 level or stages of vampirism. The first level is considered 25% vampirism and occurs 0 to 24 hours since last feeding. This is the lowest level of vampirism that the player can be at. Each level of increased vampirism gives the player a sort of reward system. For starters, there are attribute and skill bonuses that are given to the hero of Kvatch. These skills that receive a bonus are acrobatics, athletics, destruction, hand-to-hand, illusion, mysticism, and sneak. The attributes that are given a bonus are strength, willpower, and speed. This in turn can allow the player to use higher forms of spells and magic. Among the other forms of rewards given out include a resistance to normal weapons and new abilities gained that can be casted as spells. Vampirism level increases either after sleeping or waiting, and similar to the previously read creepy and disturbing pop-up message, a variation of 10 random ones can pop up after altering one's level of vampirism. The player's appearance also changes as the stages of vampirism progress. Starting off with some moderately noticeable features like red eyes, the further into foregoing feeding you get, the more contorted, gaunt, and depraved your character's features become. For the first level of vampirism, a +5 is added to the previously mentioned skills and attributes, there is a 5% resist to normal weapons, and the spell of Hunter's Sight is added, which can be casted on self for the abilities of Night Eye for 30 seconds and Detect Life for 30 seconds as well. This spell can be used repeatedly. The second level of vampirism occurs when the player has gone 24 to 48 hours without feeding. This is considered a 50% vampirism level. A +10 is added to the skills and attributes, there is a 10% resist to normal weapons, and the spell Vampire Seduction is added. This includes the ability to cast via touch for 50 points of charm for 20 seconds. This can only be used once per day. The third level of vampirism occurs when the player has gone 48 to 72 hours without feeding. This is now considered 75% vampirism. A +15 is added to the skills and attributes, there is a 15% resist to normal weapons, and the spell Reign of Terror is added. This includes the ability to cast silence for up to 20 feet and demoralize via touch, both for 60 seconds at a 1 per day use. The fourth and final level of vampirism occurs when the player has gone 72 plus hours without feeding. This is considered to be a 100% vampirism level. A plus 20 is added to the attributes and skill levels, there's a 20% resist to normal weapons, and the spell Embrace of Shadows is added. This can be casted on self to receive the Night Eye ability for 90 seconds and invisibility for 180 seconds. This spell can only be used once per day. It should be noted that upon feeding and reversing your vampirism level, the bonuses, resistance to normal weapons, and additional spells get removed and adjusted accordingly to your new level. As an example, feeding and going from vampirism level 3 to level 1 will temporarily remove the Reign of Terror spell and Vampire Seduction. The skill bonus will drop from a plus 15 to plus 5, and the resistance to normal weapons will drop from 15% to 5%. Similar to this, your appearance, as mentioned previously above, also changes back to something more human-like. So those were the advantages of vampirism. Now it's time to discuss the disadvantages of the condition. Exactly like how with every progressing stage of vampirism, more bonuses, spells, and resistance percentages were added, the same goes with certain liabilities. The two negative condition elements of vampirism include sun damage and weakness to fire. During 25% vampirism, 0 damage counters per second in the sun are inflicted on the player, and a 20% weakness to fire is added. 50% vampirism leads to 1 damage counter per second taken in the sun, and a 30% weakness to fire. 75% vampirism leads to 4 damage counters per second taken in the sun, and a 40% weakness to fire. 100% vampirism leads to 8 damage counters per second while in the sun, and 50% weakness to fire. It should be noted what the game considers daytime is from 6 AM to 8 PM, which is 14 hours of in-game time. The amount of sun damage taken can actually be increased by as much as double, depending on when the sun is at its highest and most strongest, which is usually midday. Cloud coverage and being underwater greatly reduce the amount of damage taken from the sun, but don't completely eliminate it. In some form of positive light, since there is no sun in Mehrunes Dagon's Plains of Oblivion, you will not receive any sun damage, and the same goes for just being in proximity to an Oblivion gate, as the atmosphere and sky totally change. However, the Daedra tend to use a lot of fire-based attacks, and since the player has a variable weakness to fire, these areas can prove to be incredibly dangerous and difficult. The best options are to either remain at a vampirism level of 25%, stay inside as much as possible, or only travel around during the nighttime. Fast traveling and waiting are also greatly affected by this condition, as you cannot do either while taking damage. This therefore means that you cannot fast travel during the day, and the only way to wait between the times of 6 AM and 8 PM are by being indoors. The only workaround for fast traveling during the daytime is from one of your own houses, except the one in Anvil. While inside, it's worth noting that the player cannot wait while taking damage, trespassing, or if enemies are nearby. If the player uses fast travel during the nighttime and arrives during the day, they will begin taking damage upon arrival. If the player waits during the nighttime outside and is exposed to daylight, they will take damage. If your character continues to wait while being exposed to sunlight, they will take damage and in turn die for waiting too long. The other disadvantages of vampirism include your appearance changing as mentioned before, making your character appear more gaunt, contorted, and sinister. Depending on your character's complexion, it can change their skin tone drastically in certain areas. The citizens of Cyrodiil will notice your changing appearance and comment on it. If at 100% vampirism, or stage 4, some people will outright refuse to talk to you as it's obvious you're a vampire. Similarly, at 100% vampirism, guards may refuse your yield if you've changed your mind on paying the bounty or going to jail, forcing you to fight them to the death or to flee for your life. The further into your progression, the game's lighting can actually become more distorted, showcasing your character's sensitivity to light, which can actually have a negative effect on your actual perception in the game. When regressing back to lesser stages of vampirism, your strength bonuses go down and can lead your player to becoming more easily over-encumbered. There are some additional notes for advancing through the stages of vampirism. After 24 hours has occurred for in-game time, the player needs only to wait or sleep for an hour or cancel the timer for progression to occur. These stages of vampirism, in a way, begin to queue the longer you go without actively progressing as a vampire. If the player, for example, is at 25% vampirism and hasn't fed in 1 week, then proceeds to feed on a person, upon waiting or sleeping, the vampirism level will still increase, but it will only go to 75% vampirism instead of 100% vampirism. This can easily be tackled by feeding and then sleeping or waiting until your level has gone back down, and it can easily be avoided by making sure your character goes through the progressions of vampirism on time. When feeding, it is an instantaneous transformation back to 25% vampirism. Now, what is feeding and how does the player do it? This is arguably the biggest make or break to vampirism, as this is the one action that dictates the overall level of advantages and disadvantages to being a vampire. Feeding is what the player must do in order to maintain a level of 25% vampirism or stage 1. In order to feed, the player must find a sleeping humanoid and so-called activate with them. The human cannot be paralyzed, awake, stunned, or dead, only sleeping. Now for what it means to activate with somebody. If standing normally, the options are to interact with or to feed. If sneaking, the options are to feed or to pickpocket upon approaching a sleeping humanoid. If someone witnesses you feeding, it will net you a bounty of 40 gold. The victim will also wake up if you are caught in the action. Feeding in no way harms or affects the NPC and certainly doesn't give them porphyric hemophilia. Trespassing while someone is sleeping is a trickier feed due to NPCs' higher likelihood of waking up while breaking and entering. The best places to feed are guild factions like the Dark Brotherhood and the Mages Guild, as most NPCs will stay asleep and in certain instances not even care. On the other hand, city guards often are awoken by the feeding process and should be avoided at all costs. It is impossible to feed on other vampires, as the game won't even give you the option of doing so. Beggars are a fantastic source to feed on, as they are alone and sleep outside during the nighttime. If the player has the Vile Lair plugin downloaded, there is a sleeping prisoner in Deepscorn Hollow that can easily be fed on. Arkved, the tormented wizard a part of Vermina's Shrine quest, will always remain asleep and is easy prey for a quick feed. To name a few, those are some quick and easy people to feed on. We already briefly discussed the reaction of friendly NPCs when the player is exhibiting later stages of vampirism. But what about vampires themselves? How do they react to seeing a fellow undead? Well, unfortunately and in an underwhelming manner, they don't seem to care that you're a part of their kind and still act aggressive towards and attack the player. This is likely due to vampires being extremely territorial and almost pack-like. They operate out of nests and really don't have a reason to work together with other groups of vampires, albeit the living and mortal humanoids would be a common cause to rally against. Perhaps since most instances are of the player wandering into their dens, they take it as a sign of trespassing and danger, regardless if it is another of their kind. There are unconfirmed theories that by charming a vampire as a vampire, like per se using the vampire seduction spell, they will have an increased disposition towards you and will stop attacking. However, as we know, this spell is only temporary and will not last very long, leading the vampires to act offensively towards you once more. Now let's discuss how to cure vampirism. Let's say the player had enough of living a life in the dark with a constant responsibility of feeding, or they accidentally let porphyric hemophilia run its course without getting it cured. Lucky for all of us, there's actually a way of getting rid of vampirism. In fact, there are 2 ways of curing it. The easiest way to cure vampirism is if the Vile Lair plugin is installed. There's something called a Font of Renewal, which can be used very easily at Deepscorn Hollow. This instantly cures the player of their vampirism. Now, the other way of curing this condition isn't so easy and forthcoming. It's the only way to cure vampirism in the base game, and even has an entire questline dedicated for it. The player begins by asking healers or Vicente Valtieri about a cure. They will direct the player to Raminus Polis at the Arcane University. He will then direct the player to Count Janus Hasseldor of Skingrad. The Count wants a cure for his wife created and notes that it will be in the form of a potion. He then tells the player to seek out a witch of Glenmoral who lives near the Corbollo River, as she is rumored to have more knowledge. Upon visiting her, she says she might be able to help the player, but requires 5 empty grand soul gems to begin with her aid. After retrieving the soul gems, she will give you a grocery list of sorts that includes every single ingredient required for making this potion. The easiest of ingredients to obtain are bloodgrass, garlic, and nightshade. The next and moderately difficult ingredient is the blood of an Argonian. This is likely due to their ability of resisting diseases. An enchanted dagger is given to the player, and any Argonian in the game just has to be slashed with it in order to receive the ingredient. The final and most difficult ingredient are the ashes of a powerful vampire. This is where the witch will direct the player to go kill Hindaril, located at Red Water Slough. Upon killing him, he will drop the ashes of Hindaril, the final ingredient the player needs. Upon returning to the witch and presenting the ingredients, she will tell the player to return to the hut in 24 hours. After one full day, 2 potions of cure for vampirism will be ready, one for the player to consume and one for the Count of Skingrad's wife. Upon drinking the potion, the player is instantly converted back to their regular self. Now, can the player turn into a vampire again after being fully cured? The answer is no. After visiting the Font of Renewal or consuming the Cure for Vampirism potion, the game does not allow the player to become a vampire again. The player can still contract porphyric hemophilia, the disease leading into vampirism, a theoretical infinite amount of times. However, even after 3 days and sleeping, nothing happens to the player. There are no new progressions for conditions, just drain fatigue for 5 points will remain as long as you forgo curing the disease. In other words, the ability to become a vampire is a one-time deal, and once cured, there's no going back unless using console commands. If anyone is curious on coding behind this, in the game's data and files, after transforming into a vampire, a value goes from 0 to 1, stating the player has a positive case of vampirism. Upon curing the vampirism, a new value is set to -1, which leaves the player in a negative state for the condition. Since porphyric hemophilia can only be contracted once at a time, the highest value the condition can go up after curing is 0, which means that the game can never register the player as a vampire again, as the value will never be positive again. Now let's talk from a subjective point of view on if experiencing and playing as a vampire is worth it. Going into the research for this video, I had never actually become a vampire in any of the Elder Scrolls games, and this was due to my limited knowledge that the sunlight will hurt and even kill your character. I had no clue about the various stages of vampirism, that at each stage, certain pros would occur and so would certain cons, and that even goes for how NPCs treat you. I knew that feeding was done off sleeping NPCs and that it had to be kept up with, but I didn't know why. I personally always hated fighting vampires for fear of contracting porphyric hemophilia, even though I often carried potions of cure disease, and I knew I could make it to altars and way shrines within 3 in-game days. I had heard from others that the quest, Vampire Cure, was extensive and difficult, but I didn't know the specifics. After this extensive research on vampirism, here are my conclusive thoughts. The condition receives more benefits for combat, stealth, and speechcraft the further into the stages your character gets. In turn, there is also a massive liability with not just fire spells, which are arguably the leading spells for enemy mages and Daedra using destruction magic, but also that adventuring, which is the game's backbone and entire premise, is restricted to being indoors or to only 10 hours of in-game time. While yes, the player can heal themselves constantly using restoration magic or potions while outdoors in the sunlight, I would think that that routine would eventually become irritating and distracting from the world around you. Fast traveling and waiting, 2 other massive components of the game, are greatly hindered and restricted as well. The player can, in theory, constantly force a wait for nightfall, however this seems more like a burden as they would have to find non-owned shelter to wait in. The player would have to plan everything to take place around certain times during the day, and this even includes the process of feeding. Feeding seems more like a chore than a fun feature. Unless the player knows where to feed and when to feed, the act of doing so seems like it takes more time and effort than something that should just be considered natural for the undead. If the player is on a grand scale quest or exploration, enough time can easily pass for the player to progress in vampirism level without even having had the chance to look for someone to feed on. Going back to the active effects, spells, and bonuses, a lot of them can be temporarily gained and used via enchantments or spells instead of transforming into a vampire. Socially, vampirism seems to only have negative effects with zero positive outcomes. If vampires had increased disposition and friendliness towards the player, that would be something else entirely to consider. But since they don't, it truly makes the player feel even more lonely in an already pretty isolated world. The cure for vampirism isn't too hard if the Violair plugin is activated. However, the base game quest, while not the most difficult for those with a higher level, might prove to be challenging for those with a lower level. Obtaining 5 grand soul gems, the necessary ingredients, and killing high-level vampires might be more than some people bargain for. It's also very interesting that the stages of vampirism don't regress by one stage after feeding, but in turn go from whatever level you were back to the first stage. While this could be seen as a good thing, it can also be seen as a bad thing that stages 2 and 3 are harder to maintain than 1 and 4. Stages 2 and 3 have better benefits than stage 1 and less liabilities than stage 4. Now, perhaps an argument could be made for somebody who wants to maintain a vampirism level of 25% or stage 1. There is a +5 bonus to a lot of skills and attributes, a 5% resistance to normal weapons, and a new and useful spell is added. On the other hand, there is no damage taken from sunlight, only a 10% weakness to fire, and NPCs will still maintain their friendly disposition with you. A stage 1 level of 25% vampirism doesn't seem too bad and actually could almost be considered worth it. However, that positive thought is brought crumbling down when I remember that I would have to keep up with feeding every 24 hours, or else an abundance of even more tasks, responsibilities, and restrictions would be added back to my character. Not to mention, sleeping and waiting would become worrisome events, as those are the ways in which the progressions take hold of your character. My biggest and most irrational fear when it comes to being a vampire is trapping my character in a save file where the sunlight ultimately ends up killing my character in an infinite loop of respawning and death. Similarly, but toned down, is dying by the sunlight. My autosave is now the infinite death loop, and now I have to reload a save point way back in time. Overall, without knowing the full deal of becoming a vampire, it was nothing I wanted my character to be a part of. And now knowing the ins and outs and full bargain of transforming into a creature of the night, I still don't think it's a good idea, having realized that the risks and restrictions far outweigh the rewards. The best reasons for someone to become a vampire would be for extra difficulty added to the game. With all the new responsibilities and self-management the player has to go through, it certainly would add a whole new level to the gameplay. The second reason is for the immersive and role-playing experience. Perhaps your character is someone who is amoral or even chaotic/lawful evil. Vampirism would make for an amazing addition to how you'd like to be perceived by and even treat the fellow citizens of Cyrodiil. The final reason for becoming a vampire would simply be so you can then complete the Vampire Cure quest or use the Font of Renewal and never have to worry about becoming a vampire ever again. This would be very useful when engaged in combat with vampires again and not needing to worry about the lasting effects of porphyric hemophilia. These were some objective facts, background knowledge, and lore on vampirism mixed in with a subjective opinion and point of view. If there's anything crucial I missed on vampirism as a whole, I'd love to know. I'd also really appreciate hearing your thoughts on if you think the pros outweigh the cons when becoming a vampire in Oblivion. If okay and efficient at maintaining feeding, vampirism level, and the time of day, there is certainly a case to be made for staying as a vampire. Until next time, keep those potions of cure disease handy, or stick to the shadows when feeding on your prey. Either way, continue with the adventure.